This is the Sony a6700 with the Tamron 50 to 400 millimeter. And the reason why this setup is so unique, because you can't find this setup for this price, this weight, and you're pretty much not gonna be able to get this with any of the other competitors in its class. So if you're looking at any other camera brand other than Sony, like Canon or Fuji or Nikon or anyone else, you're not gonna find a focal range that goes to 50 to 400. So this lens is about $1,100 brand new. If you look at the equivalent to like what you can find with Canon, you can find a Canon 100 to 400 for about $600, but it doesn't have the speed that this has, because at 400 millimeters, the Canon is about f8, where at 400 millimeters, this is 6.3. Now, maybe you want the 100 to 500, which is actually a longer focal length than this one. Well, that one's gonna set you back about $2,500, and the aperture is still around 6.7 at 500 millimeters. And with the a67 camera body, you get that extra 1.5x. So the 400 millimeters actually becomes a 600 millimeters. So in my opinion, I think for wildlife, for sports, for anyone who wants to get really close around the 400 millimeter to 600 millimeter focal range, I think this is the camera to get. And I also think it's a really good lens and camera combination, because this lens will start at 50 millimeters, and you're not gonna be able to get this focal range in any other camera setup. And 50 millimeters is gonna give you the focal range equivalent of about 75 millimeters all the way to 600 millimeters, which is a huge range. And that's about the perfect focal length for anyone who wants the perfect telephoto zoom lens. Now, before I explain who this lens is really for, I was actually just using this camera and lens combination out in the field the other day. It was a foggy day and I was just doing some wildlife photography. Today we are driving to do some birding, and I'm taking this guy.
Woohoo!
Here's the Sony 24 to 105, and this is the 50 to 400. Sometimes in the fog, it can be a little bit challenging for wildlife, and a lot of the birds were really far away from me, so it was just really hard to get close shots on some of them. But I was actually using the Tamron 50 to 400 with the Sony 24 to 105, and I'll be honest with you, these are probably not the best two lenses to compare, but I was able to get some decent shots with both lenses of birds that were flying close to me and away from me, and I found that the autofocus was pretty similar. I actually had more shots missed with my Sony 24 to 105, and that could be just because it doesn't have the panning option when you're tracking birds really quickly. Also, I probably didn't have the fastest shutter speed that I would prefer, but I felt like the Tamron 50 to 400 did a pretty good job for just tracking. The autofocus was incredible, and then also I thought the sharpness was really good for this camera and lens combination. Like, you had really good sharpness with the 26 megapixel sensor on the Sony a6700. Okay, so let's talk more about why the Tamron 50 to 400 millimeter is so different than any other lens. So 50 to 400 millimeters actually becomes like a 75 to 600 millimeters, which in my opinion is the perfect focal length. If you get the Sony 100 to 400, that's an equivalent of 150 to 600 millimeters. So can you see how big a difference this is? Now, if you want the best of the best, you want to get the maximum closeness that you can get for wildlife, get the Sony 200 to 600 millimeter, because that's going to give you the maximum aperture performance and also the maximum focal length that you could ever get. But it comes with a little bit increased price, and the Sony 200 to 600 becomes like a 300 to 900. So that's going to give you that perfect range for getting shots that are really far away. But if you want it both far away and close up, the Tamron 50 to 400, I think, is the perfect focal range for that. Okay, let's talk about another lens. So Tamron also has another lens for Sony that's an APS-C lens. So it's gonna actually be lighter than the 50 to 400, and it's the 18 to 300 millimeter. So the 18 to 300 ends up being like a 24 to 400 millimeter. This is 3.5 to 6.3, so you're gonna get about the same maximum aperture at the longest focal length. And I think it's just a really good range if you want to be able to capture wide and telephoto. And I think the Tamron 18 to 300 is just perfect for anyone who's just doing landscapes, who needs that wide focal length, but they also want to get really close. I think it's perfect for that because you don't really need to worry about aperture if you're doing landscape photography. But if you're more into sports and wildlife, I think the Tamron 50-400 is probably the better option to go. Now, the last lens to discuss is the Sony 70-350. This lens is ultralight. This is probably the perfect lens in my opinion because it is so lightweight. It's way lighter than the Tamron 50-400, and you pretty much get that close distance you need with like a standard 100 to 400 millimeter lens. But the Sony ends up being like a 100 to 500, and it's pretty comparable to this camera and lens setup because it's a 100 to 500, whereas this is more like a 75 to 600. So this is better. You're gonna get a better focal length out of it. But with the Sony, you're gonna get a lens that's made just for APS-C, and it's gonna be so much lighter in weight and shorter. So this, as you can see, it sticks pretty far out. With the Sony, you're not gonna have that issue. It's almost the same size as the Sony 24 to 105. It's just a little bit longer. This is quite a bit longer than the Sony 24 to 105. So I'll show you here real quick. So this is my camera bag. I can fit this in my camera bag, no problem, but you can't fit anything else in here. And it would be nice if I could just shove it down straight like this, but it's gonna stick way far out. And so that's just one problem that I have with this lens. And if you have a smaller lens like the Sony 75 to 350, it's just gonna fit in your camera bag better, especially if you use a camera bag like a sling. That's the camera bag preference that I use. And this, I can fit it in there, but I can't fit any other lenses in there. And that's another reason why I think this is a great camera setup to get, because if you get a bigger lens than this, if you get the 200 to 600, you're not gonna be able to lug that thing around. And that's the main reason why I don't like the 200 to 600. If you get the Sony 100 to 400, that lens and this camera body aren't even gonna fit in my bag. I'd have to get a larger camera bag. And that's not a huge issue for some of you, but the weight differences is pretty significant compared to the Tamron 50 to 400. All right, now let's talk about build quality with the Tamron 50 to 400. This, I would say, has excellent build quality. The few cons with it, I would say I don't love how the focus ring is closer. It seems like Tamron does this with all of their lenses where they keep the focus ring more proximal rather than distal to the camera. My preference is to have it standard like every other Sony lens, but I know they're doing this for weight savings. They just keep that focus ring nice and close. But I will say in some instances it's nice to have. So I have my camera body set up to autofocus, but if I have it also set to where when I move the focus ring, it automatically reverts to manual focus. And with Sony lenses, I can't tell you how often that I'll be zooming in and I accidentally hit that focus ring. With the Tamron, it's less of a problem because my hand's it's way out here, and so it's not that big of an issue. Another thing I dislike about the build quality is the throw with this. So you're gonna really have to twist it to get all the way to that 400 millimeters. With the Sony lenses, you're not gonna have this big of a throw. With the Sony 100 to 400 or the Sony 200 to 600, you just barely turn your hand and you get that full maximum range. With this one, I have to really turn it to get it all the way out there. Now, who is this camera set up for? I'm gonna say it's mostly for wildlife photographers, but you can also use it as a landscape photographer, as a portrait photographer, for sports, for weddings. But I would say it's probably not the best travel camera setup, because for traveling, if you want the lightest setup, I would go with the 75 to 350 from Sony. But it's not that heavy, and I have traveled with it. But when I travel with it, I don't want to take any other lens. First of all, because I can't fit it in my camera body, and second of all, it's just heavy to take this with any other lens setup. Now, for full frame, I think this is great for travel because you just kind of need one lens for everything. You can't get the ultra wide shots, but in most cases, you can just take multiple shots and do a large panoramic image, or just make the shot wider. That's the nice thing about having a long lens, is you can capture both wide and telephoto lenses. You just have to take multiple images to make your image much larger, and that way you also get more megapixels in your image. So if you think about it, this is a 75 to 600 millimeter lens, but if you stitch the photos together, you can make it as wide as you want. And that's another reason why I'm starting to think that APS-C is the way to go, because you get that maximum focal length, and then you can get as wide as you want as long as you're stitching images together. Okay, so let's go over the pros and cons. I'm gonna say the Tamron 50-400 is the lightest 600mm lens that you can find in its class. Another pro is if you decide later on you wanna go with full frame, or maybe you already have a full frame camera, this lens is compatible with full frame. And last but not least, for pros, it's a sharp lens and it has great autofocus performance. I would say you have a really good keeper rate for autofocus. I definitely did miss some shots, and you're probably gonna find a little bit better autofocus with like the 200-600 or the 100-400, but you're not gonna notice that big of a difference. Now, what are the cons with this camera? So the aperture is a 4.5 to 6.3. I know for some people that's not gonna work for them. They want the maximum aperture that you can get, like the Sony 100-400 has a maximum aperture of 5.6 at 400mm. It has a long throw, which can be kind of annoying. It doesn't come standard with a tripod collar, which that's something that you can pay extra for, but it's just something annoying that it doesn't come standard with. Another con, I'm just gonna say the weight. Even though this is really light, you can get a lighter camera body and lens combo if you get like the Sony 75-350. It's just a little bit front heavy. I can hold it one-handed, but I feel like it's probably not the best for my mount right here, and it's just, I mean, you can look at it, it's pretty long, and it's definitely front heavy. And another thing that I didn't mention earlier is with the Sony a6700, I love this camera body, I love the grip on it, but I have medium to large hands, and so for people that have really big hands, this is probably not the best camera body to get, just because it's not gonna have as good of grip. As you can see, I can fit all my fingers on here, like no problem, but a lot of people are complaining that they can't fit their pinky finger on there. It's just not a good grip for people with large hands. Now, be sure to check out my other video on where I do a full review of the Tamron 50-400. I'll link that right here. And share your thoughts and comments below. I want to hear what you think about this setup. And please like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.